Hello and welcome to a deck profile for Premium. This time we're talking about Regalia, which is the strongest Genesis archetype available. It's really the only viable Genesis deck in Premium, Fenrir Control being the one exception, which is a very niche and hard to play strategy. This deck generally is competitive. Sometimes it's a tier 1 deck, and right now it's floating around a little bit closer to tier 2, but still pretty strong. It got second at Worlds and has topped, I think, 2 or 3 times this BSF season, so it's clearly still a reasonable contender and something you should be prepared for. Regalia is a archetype-specific, high synergy, hybrid combo aggro deck. You're trying to amass a lot of Regalia-named cards and assemble a restanding Vanguard with a late-game checkmate scenario of a full board restand for something around 9 attacks with the optimal board setup, with half of those roughly having extra crit if you go Force 2. This deck has a ton of card draw, a ton of soul charge, and access to an easy countercharger that isn't limited to hard once per turn, so we can generate a ton of resources to the point that we can actually deck ourselves out, churning through our resources. Without any further ado, let's get into the deck. Starting off with our starter, Pan of New Style. Any V-era Genesis starter will work. We just want something that draws a card and makes quick shield. Whenever they print a Regalia named one, that one will automatically become the best option. Next up is our primary ride target, and we're looking at 3 copies of Regalia of Wisdom Angelica. We are playing a 3-1 split with this and Frigg, which I'll get to in a second. This card introduces us to the primary mechanic of Regalia and Premium, which is Divine Gauge. Divine Gauge is a mechanic where you put cards face down from your soul under rearguards to either pay costs by discarding those gauges or to have them around to give static effects. In this case, Angelica says that all of our rearguards with Divine Gauge cannot be chosen by the opponent's card effects, and they get plus 5,000, which is a very strong protection effect to keep our units safe on our opponent's turn. And then when it attacks, we can choose up to 2 of our rearguards, put up to 1 card from our soul face down as Divine Gauge for each of them, and at the end of our opponent's turn, we can discard 5 Divine Gauges to heal a card from the damage zone. That last effect is really strong, but we're almost never going to use it. We have better things to spend Divine Gauge on, and it's actually somewhat difficult to amass 5 Divine Gauge in play. That essentially translates to 5 cards from our soul being used as face down Divine Gauge. We're mostly interested in that first effect for the protection this offers on our opponent's turn. This is obviously not active when we've used Stride, because this becomes a heart card and isn't the Vanguard. So we do have to be wary of that. One of the main weaknesses of this deck is that its protection effects are turned off on our turn, so decks with interactive G-Guardians or other defensive plays that can retire units on our battle phase can really disrupt our game plan. This one being anti-choose effects is really strong, and it's complemented by Regalia of Blessed Love Frigg. Frigg has a similar effect, but instead of preventing being chosen, it prevents leaving the R by card effects. So this will get around effects that don't choose units, like mass retire, or front row retire, or column retire. Those kinds of effects, this will stop cleanly. It also gives 5k, and it has an interesting Vanguard skill. For the cost of Counterblast 1, we can look at the top 5 cards of the deck, choose a card from among them and call it, and then shuffle our deck, and if we call the Regalia, we can choose up to 2 rearguards and put a card from our soul face down as Divine Gauge for them. So that helps us build a board. It helps us find CEO Yggdrasil, our most important combo piece. But generally, we're not going to be using this because this is a deck where we want to choose to go second so that we can stride on our first grade 3 turn. This is really only useful in the event that we were forced to go first. And then it has another follow-up effect of, at the beginning of our turn, if our opponent has 4 or less damage, and we can discard 5 Divine Gauge and choose one of our opponent's Vanguards and deal it 1 damage. Again, this is a really niche effect that we're probably not going to use because, again, getting 5 Divine Gauge is hard and we have better things, but there's some scenario where we assembled a ton of Divine Gauge somehow, and our opponent is at, let's say, 3 damage, and we want to push them up to 4 to make sure that all of our Force 2 columns are lethal. Next up is the best card in the deck, the most important card in the deck, the one you must find at all costs every single game, CEO Yggdrasil. This card gives all of our rearguards a Divine Gauge boost, which will enable our primary booster to do its thing. And if this card's on V, and it's our opponent's turn, our rearguards cannot be affected by our opponent's cards. So this gives us an ironclad protection effect, the best possible wording, I think, that we could hope for. And as an act skill, we can counterblast 1, search our deck for a Regalia Fate Norn, and call it to R. And then we can choose 2 of our rearguards and put a card from our soul face down as Divine Gauge. Finding Norn on a hard search for counterblast 1 is really strong, and while Norn's effect also costs counterblast, the fact that we have an easy countercharger in this deck means that we're very rarely going to be overtaxed on our counterblast. We usually should be able to pay for all the effects we need to make sure the deck functions. But this hard search is really strong. This protection effect is really good when we have to ride this as a Vanguard. And this unit works well both as a back row booster, because we can put a gauge under it and it becomes a 30k booster, or it can be a decent front row attacker, especially with a Norn behind it. Easily the best card in the deck, and this combined with the rest of its package, with the Norns and with the Ablation Regalia of ours, is a synergy so strong that you can consider playing those Regalia cards in non-Regalia themed decks, like Fenrir. Next up is the aforementioned Regalia Fate Norn. This is the second best card in the deck. What this card does is, as an act skill on VRR, we can counterblast 1, draw a card, choose a rearguard, and put a card from our soul face down as Divine Gauge, and then if we did, we can soul charge 2. This builds an insane amount of resources. For the low cost of 1 CB, we're getting a Divine Gauge, which we need for a lot of our effects, and we're getting soul charge 2, and we're drawing a card, which is excellent value. One of the most efficient CB to value generating cards that you'll see in this format, actually. And then its second effect is, at the end of the battle, it boosted a Regalia unit. You can discard a card from hand, and one of this unit's Divine Gauge, stand the boosted unit, and that unit gets plus 10k and drive -1. This is extremely powerful. This is an easy way to get restanding columns, restanding vanguards, and the fact that it gives a 10k on the restand means that we'll be able to essentially swing twice with good numbers, because it's like swinging boosted twice. Just a really all-around solid card. We don't really want to mulligan for this, though, because we can hard search it with Yggdrasil, and we generally want to see 2 of these a game or so. We want 1 behind the Vanguard and then 1 behind a rearguard column with a Force 2, so that we have lots of threatening restands. And then next up, we have Lurigisa. Regalia of Aval Lurigisa is a really solid setup card. It's our best ride target going up from 0 to 3, and it helps us set up our win con stride in the late game. What this does is, when it's placed on V, we counterblast 1, we look at the top 5 cards of the deck, choose a card from among them, call it to R, and shuffle. And if we call the Regalia unit, we can choose one of our rearguards and put a card face down from Soul's Divine Gauge. And then when it's placed on R, we can choose 2 cards with Regalia and their names from our drop and put them into Soul. So this will help us get Regalia names into Soul to pay for our main stride, Minerva, which cares very much about Soul Blasting Regalia names specifically. This card, combined with Norn, and combined with other cards in our deck, will allow us to build a ton of Soul for very little cost, which will allow us to pay the heavy, steep cost of Soul Blasting 9 Regalia names to get our full power turn on turn 4. Next up is 2 copies of Demon Exorcism Regalia Thrud. This card is probably the worst card with Regalia in its name that we can still play. What it does is, when placed, we put a card from our soul face down as Divine Gauge for this unit, and then at the end of the battle, it attacked or boosted. Remember, Yggdrasil will give it the ability to boost if it has Divine Gauge. This unit will move itself into Soul, move its Divine Gauge to another rearguard, and then draw a card. So this primarily is used to make our units disappear on our opponent's turn, so that they don't have anything to attack into, or to damage deny us, or to target with removal effects. If we only have 1 Divine Gauge under our Norn, but we play this card, we can use the Norn, use its Divine Gauge, and then swing with this and move its Divine Gauge under the Norn to protect it on our opponent's turn. And the fact that it draws a card will help us set up for the next turn. It's a Regalia name, so it'll help us pay for Minerva's effect, but overall, it's not a very strong card. It doesn't gain very much. It doesn't gain power at all, and it's just a 10k beat stick at the end of the day. We're really just playing it for the name and for the Divine Gauge effect. And whenever they print us a better Regalia card to put in the slot, we will absolutely play that over this. Next up is a single copy of Knight of Protective Sphere Arthen. This is a card from D format. In the front row, this card gets the effect all of your rearguards with different card names from this unit cannot be chosen by the opponent's card effects, and it has an irrelevant effect because we're never going to Persona Ride. This is primarily just to make sure that our opponent can't use an interactive G-Guardian or other defensive play to kill an Yggdrasil during our battle phase. If Yggdrasil dies in the battle phase, all of our units with Divine Gauge will lose the ability to boost, so Norn won't be able to restand the Vanguard or the rearguard in front of it, and that's a really big problem. However, this isn't a Regalia name, and it has to be in the front row for its effect. So playing this will necessarily weaken the power of our maximum power ceiling turn. We can't get the full 9 attacks with this card because it doesn't have Regalia in its name. But because we're using Force 2 for a lot of our pressure, we can generally afford to miss out on that last column because it wasn't going to be very effective anyways. Next up is our recursion package. We have a single copy of Knight of Excision Dio-Ruing and a single copy of Freezing Magic Froros. Dio-Ruing has the effect that if your Vanguard only has one clan, which it always will in Premium because our clan is Genesis, we can Soul Blast 1 and discard a card when this is placed on R, and we can choose a card with the same clan as our Vanguard from our drop and put it in our hand. So this can essentially get us back almost anything in our deck that we want, with the exception of this card and itself. And it can pick up our stand trigger, which is extremely important because our stand trigger has an excellent rearguard effect. Just a solid way to fill in the gaps for whatever we're missing, and the fact that this deck blind soul charges a lot means that we can mitigate some of the RNG of that by finding the card out of our soul that we need. And then we have Freezing Magic Froros, which has a similar recursion role in the deck. What this card does is when it's placed on R, if we have a grade 3 or greater Minerva Vanguard, so we have to be on the Minerva stride to use this because we don't play a Minerva in the main deck, we can Soul Blast 2 and choose 2 normal units for the same card name from our drop and without Sentinel. And if we chose 2, we can put 1 in a hand and put the rest in the deck and shuffle. So this will help us ensure that we have the requisite 8 cards in deck we need to not deck out when we do our restanding Vanguard play, because this deck will get drive +1, so we'll be swinging for quad drive into triple drive. So we need 8 cards to not lose the game to that last drive check. Also, this can synergize really strongly with a bunch of our Regalia cards to generate more soul than it cost. Lurigisa will put 2 Regalia names into soul, so we can essentially trade 2 non-Regalia names to pay for this cost into 2 Regalia names, or we can find copies of Oblation Regalia Var, or we can grab a copy of Norn from the drop and put it in hand and put 1 back into deck and then search that one out with Yggdrasil to make sure that we can get a double Norn setup on turn 4 for our combo kill. Aside from that, it's just a 10k, so we probably won't care about this unit very much after it's served its purpose of recurring a card. Next up is our grade 1s, and we'll start with the best grade 1 in the deck, Oblation Regalia Var. This is the third part of the Regalia engine. What this card does is when it attacks or boosts at the end of the battle, you can put a card from your soul face down as Divine Gauge under it. And then as an act skill, you can discard a Divine Gauge from this unit, soul charge 3, and if you have a Vanguard with Regalia in its name, you can retire this unit and countercharge 1. So this builds a very absurd amount of resources. When combined with Norn, it can discount Norn's counterblast by countercharging back the damage that you spent on Norn's effect, and essentially give you a soul charge 5 and a card draw for almost nothing. That's an extremely fast resource generation engine. You can use this multiple times over several turns if you don't use the counter charge. So you can get a lot of soul generation out of this if you really need to. And it combos really well with Yggdrasil. If you have this card in play and you use Yggdrasil to find Norn, you will then be able to use Yggdrasil's second part of that effect, where you put a Divine Gauge under 2 rearguards, and you choose the Var as one of them, and then you can just discard that Divine Gauge to get the Soul Charge 3 and Counter Charge, and then use that flipped up damage to pay for the Norn that you just searched for to activate its ability. That will let you churn through your deck really fast. You're thinning by hard searching, you're drawing cards off Norn, you're soul charging a lot. You'll very rapidly end up with a very small compressed deck. Next up is our Grade 3 Searcher, Regalia Benevolent Wind Flap Angel. This card is an effect similar to other Grade 3 Searchers, where when we place it on R from hand, we choose a Grade 3 Regalia, that's the unique part, from our hand, reveal it, and then we can search for a Grade 3 Regalia, and then add it to hand, and then discard a card. This will help us essentially find any gaps in our package. We can find one of the cards of the 3-1 split, whichever one is better for the matchup, or we can find Yggdrasil or a ride target if we have one or the other. And then it also counts as grade +2 when it's discarded for stride. So this will just discard as a grade 3 and let us one card stride more often. And again, it's a Regalia name, which matters for Minerva. And then next up, we have our perfect guards. 4 copies of Regalia, Frost Jotun. You can cut one of these and play an Elementaria, and it's fine. What this card does is it's got the perfect guard effect where you choose a card from your hand and discard it, and you give a unit can't be hit, but it has to be a Regalia unit. And then at GB1, when this card is put from drop or from soul into the drop zone, you can bind this card face up and choose a card with the same name and add it to your hand. So it's essentially a recursion perfect guard. Self-recycling as long as you have multiples of these. So we can get a lot of extra perfect guards over the course of a long game like this, sometimes upwards of 6 perfect guards in one game if we play our cards right. And this also mitigates the downside of riding one of these as a grade 1. If you ride it as a grade 1 and Soul Blast it out later, you'll be able to pick up a card from the drop with the same name. So it's a really strong engine here, and I think that more than justifies playing these perfect guards. And the fact that they have Regalia in their name also just is icing on top of the cake. Next up is our trigger lineup, and we're playing a 2-2 split of Eyes the Fortress and Regalia of Service Air. The grade 3 heal has a useful defensive effect when you're trying to stop early pressure. If you haven't ridden grade 3 yet, you can either choose to give your Vanguard 10k until end of turn, or give the attacking unit -2 crit until end of that battle. And then these are grade 3s, so they pitch for stride, which makes them generally pretty good. However, this deck, again, needs a lot of Regalia names in Soul, so we don't want to play too many copies of any cards that don't have Regalia in their name, which is why we're playing this 2-2 split with Regalia of Service Air. This one has the effect that when it's discarded for the cost of G-Guardian, you can bind this in another heal trigger from your drop, and you can countercharge or soul charge 1. That's just going to help us make sure we have enough resources. As we're defending ourselves, we can figure out what we're going to need for our next turn. Our G-Guardians are very good at building soul, so we're generally going to be using this to build extra countercharge. Next up is our crits, and we are starting with 4 copies of Steakvetter Thvidi. This is the History Collection draw crit. They've been errata to be 10k power, 15k shield, and you draw a card when you damage check these, making them the best crits you can play. And then next we have 3 copies of the Stride crit, Dragon Ancestral Deity of Progression, Mushusu. Yeah, Mushusu. These pitch to Stride as a grade 3, making them just another way to inflate the amount of grade value we have in our deck to pay for strides, reducing the number of times we have to pitch 2 cards. And then we have 3 copies of Regalia of Hypnocenter Kukurihime. This is only played because it has Regalia in its name. It is a 5k trigger, which is very unfortunate, but we must play it. It also has a useful secondary effect. When you put this unit into you can put this unit into your Soul's and Act skill, and if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard, you choose a unit and it gets 3k, and if you have a face card in your G zone, you draw a card. So it's a free way to put a Regalia name into Soul for the number of Regalia names we need for Minerva, and it'll give 3k to something, so if we have a 10k column, we can make that a magic number instead, and the draw card is just a nice way to dig for combo pieces. And then next we have our stand trigger. This is Dreaming Dragon. This has the effect that on R at GB1, you put this unit on top of your deck at the end of your turn, and you shuffle your drop zone into your deck, and then if you shuffle 10 or more cards from your drop zone back into the deck, you draw a card. So this is really important for making sure that we don't deck ourselves out, and it gives us a second chance at killing the opponent in the event that they hit defensives or the overtrigger or something. So we're usually going to want to activate this effect at least once a game, but it's not a Regalia name, it's not a critical trigger, so we can't play too many copies of it, and we can at least use Dio Ruing to get this back if we accidentally soul charge it, or if we damage it and heal it out of damage later. So it's not the end of the world that we're only playing 1 copy, and some games you'll never need it. And then last, we have the Overtrigger. This is the vanilla OT. I think the regular one is called Spiritual King of Determination Albaria, I think. But you can play either the blue, red, or this OT, and they're all okay. The blue OT is probably the best one overall. I'm mostly playing this one because I have the fancy version. You just don't want to play the light OT, black OT, or Keter OT. The Keter OT will deck you out. The extra drive checks will cause you to just run out of cards in deck and you'll lose the game. The red OT gives you one more attack with 100 million, but this deck already has a full board restand, so that one more attack doesn't matter that much. The blue OT, being a crit trigger, is really impactful, and picking up a card from your drop zone is really good. So the blue OT is probably the better one overall. And the black OT doesn't really give us any additional kill pressure because the superior call is going to call over something that was going to restand anyways. So it's not benefiting us. It's not really giving us another attack in a lot of scenarios. And the healing a card from your damage from the black OT effect will actually punish you sometimes because it will allow your opponent to heal out of your lethal turn. Instead of having to heal on 6, they might be able to heal on 5 now. This one will give you the most number of swings with 100 million because you can pick your Vanguard and a Rearguard, and your Rearguards will restand from Norn's effect if you have Norn boosting them. Your Vanguard will restand if Norn's behind it, and then Minerva's second skill is a full board restand, so you can get potentially 400 million swings out of it if you use this OT. So I think it's really closest between this and the blue OT. The blue OT one is probably going to give you surprise wins in the early game where you swing with the Force 2 Vanguard, your opponent no guards or 2 to passes, and then you hit blue OT plus crit. You're going to end up dealing like 4 damage out of nowhere. So for the early game cheese wins, the blue OT is better. For the checkmate unbeatable late game wins, this one's better. And then lastly, we have a single copy of Bracing Angel Ladder. This is important just to make sure that our opponent can't kill our Yggdrasils or our Norns during our battle phase. And it also builds soul, but it's not a Regalia name, so unfortunately it'll mostly be used just to pay for the generic soul blast costs on a few of our cards. But the protection effect is primarily why we're here. And in matchups where the opponent can't interact with our board on our turn, we can just pitch it to stride. Next up is the G-Zone. We have 4 copies of Ultimate Regalia of Almighty Minerva. This is easily the best stride you can play. What it does is you can Soul Blast 3 cards with Regalia name and turn a copy of her face up and give your Vanguard 10k in a drive. And then at GB3, you can Soul Blast 6 cards with Regalia in their name at the end of the battle she attacks. And you can stand all of your units with Regalia in their name and they get drive -3. So this gives us a ton of pressure on our first stride because already a 15 on a 13 is 28, and then another 10 is 38 plus drive 1, so you're getting 4 drive checks. And then if you boost with Norn, that's a total of 48 with 4 drive checks. That takes an absurd amount of shield value if your opponent wants the 2 to pass it, even more if they want a 3 to pass it. So they basically have to PG or die because 4 drive checks and a Force 2 on the Vanguard means there's a really good chance you're going to hit multiple crits and deal 4 or more damage on one swing. The second effect of giving the full board restand just allows us to close out the game with lots of swings with additional crit because we can ride another grade 3, get a Force 2 on the other column, and get so many attacks that threaten lethal, especially if our opponent had to no guard the Vanguard on turn 3 and go up to 4. This card just is easily single-handedly keeping Genesis relevant in the current meta. This is the best stride we have access to. You should be striding into this every chance you get. And the whole deck needs to be configured with getting the Soul Blast 6 and Soul Blast 3 in the same turn in mind. If a card doesn't have Regalia in its name, you need to think long and hard about what role that card is serving you. So that's our plan A. Let's look at the plan Bs. First off, we have Prehistoric Regalia Earth. This card has the effect of auto on place, counterblast 1, turn a copy of her face up. And if you have a hard card with Regalia in its name, you put all the cards with Regalia in your drop zone into your soul. And then if the number of face of cards with Regalia in their name in your G zone is 2 or more, until end of turn, this unit gets, as an act skill, Soul Blast 6, this unit gets 10k and a crit until end of turn. So you usually use this when, for whatever reason, you can't go into Minerva, but you already have at least 1 Minerva face up in the G zone. So usually in the scenario you use this is you have no soul and you're on second stride or third stride. In the case of using on third stride, it's usually because you've used all of your Minervas and you no longer have any left. And then if you couldn't recycle your deck with the Dreaming Dragon, you just get to put all the Regalias into Soul and then Soul Blast them all out for a huge Vanguard swing, hopefully with a Norn behind it to restand it to make this back-to-back lethal swings. This also can get the potential to one-shot kill the opponent with a Force 2 marker. So even if your opponent's been staying at super low damage, you can still threaten game with this card. And then they have to choose between no guarding one of these or having no counterblast to work with on their turn. Next up is Yagda Naruga, which also gives us access to a backup win condition. What this card does is when this unit attacks, we turn a card from our G-Zone face up and choose any number of cards at different grades from our drop, put them into Soul. This unit gets 10k until end of turn. And when our opponent's unit is put on G, other than from their deck, we can Soul Blast 3 to retire that unit, and our opponent looks at the top card of the deck and calls it to G. So this is a way to potentially deck the opponent out if their deck size is very small and you have a lot of Soul, which you can easily set up if you're playing carefully. You can basically look at the number of cards left in their deck and look at the amount of damage they're going to take if they no-guard your swings, and you can checkmate them. You can put them in a scenario where the choices are either to guard and get milled out or to not guard and take lethal. And sometimes, if your opponent doesn't have perfect guards, retiring the high shield value cards they're putting on G and then them blindly calling normal units with low shield value will just kill them out of nowhere. And then we have one copy of Amaruta Ampharos. This is either a setup stride or a weird late game closer, depending on how your game has played out. It has Revelation V, which just lets you look at the top card and choose to leave it on top or soul charge it. And then, more importantly, it has an axe skill, counterblast 1, and turn a card from your G-Zone face up. Until end of turn, one of your rear guards gets 10k in a crit, and if your soul is 4 or less cards, you draw 2 and soul charge 5. So when you basically have nothing going on, you can go into this stride and at least draw some cards and build a bunch of soul and get a little bit of extra kill pressure. And then it has a very expensive effect. At the end of the battle it attacked, you can Soul Blast 15 and stand a rear guard, and until end of turn your opponent cannot call Sentinels. This is, if you can pull this off, it's very likely to kill the opponent because you can have columns with Norn and Yggdrasil that will restand themselves, so you can swing unboosted, swing with this, restand that, and now you have you can restand the Vanguard with Norn and potentially have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 attacks with Sentinel Restrict, and potentially extra crit if you have Force 2 markers, or if you got a crit from this effect. It's pretty scary if you can build up the 15 soul to pull it off, but building 15 soul and getting divine gauges for Norn and also having all these pieces is a pretty unlikely scenario. In the event that it happens, though, you will almost certainly win the game on the spot, unless your opponent has a ton of G-Guardians in hand. And then next up we have Hero Deity of Polar Extremity Marduk. This is our superior stride to use when we're forced to go first. We generally want to go second with this deck. But what it does is, from the G-Zone, when our Vanguard attacks, if our Vanguard is grade 3, we can Counterblast 1 and Soul Blast 6, and stride this card on V as rest from face down, and it gets the power and crit one of our Heart cards got from trigger effects this turn until end of turn. And we change the attacking unit to this unit for the battle. So the combo is, you swing boosted with Norn, which will give you Twin Drive, and then you restand your Vanguard, you swing again, and then you stride into this, and whatever triggers you got from your first 2 drive checks you put onto this, so that it'll be swinging for anywhere from 28 to 48 if you got double triggers. And you'll get triple drive, so you'll go from 2 checks to 3 checks, which will give you a decent amount of card draw going first, a little bit of extra kill pressure because you'll be on Force 2, generally speaking, and it'll give you GB1, which will let you get to GB3 on your second stride, even if you had to go first and you don't have any G-Guardians. That being said, the cost is very expensive, and sometimes you simply won't be able to get CEO, Yggdrasil, and Norn set up and be able to pay for this card. In which case, you should, if you have an Yggdrasil, you should hold it, and you should just go for this to get the GB so that you can turn 4 kill the opponent. Or you'll have, if you have G-Guardians, you can forego this card, and you can use G-Guardians on the opponent's turn to get the GB, and instead use your Counterblast on Soul to build a better board and a more threatening setup. And then next we have our G-Guardians, I'll lay them all out all at once because they're a toolkit that needs to be all considered together. All of our G Guardians do some kind of setup play. This one will allow us to put, this one also flip a G Guardian face up, and it will put up to 3 cards with the same grade that are normal units from our drop or soul back into deck, and then it'll get 5k for each for a maximum of 30k shield total. So this will help us recycle stuff into the deck. This one will let us pick cards with different grades from our drop and put them into soul and get 5k if we got 2, and then another 10k if we got 4. So if we go a 0, 1, 2, 3, and a 4, or a 0, 1, and 2, and a 3, we'll get the 4 and get a total of 30k shield. And this will build 4 cards in soul for the cost of discarding 1 heal trigger, which is pretty good. And then lastly, for our maximum power for defense, we have Sky Enforcing Light Dragon and Avarta. This card will, when it's put on G, you put a card from hand or rear into soul, and it gets 10k shield. And then you can put 2 more from hand or rear into soul, and you can choose one of your opponent's unit and give it -2 crit. Now, it gives it -2 crit till end of turn, which means that you can shut down a restander for the rest of the turn. You can give this to you can guard 1 attack with this and give a different attacker -2 crit to potentially guard 2 attacks with 1 card. You can give the Vanguard -2 crit to work as a pseudo-perfect guard for the Vanguard. And you can put useless cards that have already served their purpose from rear guard into soul and deny your opponent the ability to attack your rears to damage deny you. If they attacked rear guard first, you can eat your front row into soul for this card, and then your opponent has to choose between swinging with the Vanguard and getting drive checks but giving you damage, or not swinging with the Vanguard and not giving drive checks but denying you damage, which you can then hard punish with your counter charge effects. Overall, this G Guardian package is actually pretty strong. It mostly solves the problems our deck faces, which is getting Regalia names into soul, these two their own ways, and this one solves the problem of decking out. And then lastly, we have a single copy of Harmonics Messiah, which is a mandatory inclusion in every premium deck. It gives you a 20k Guardian Shield ticket when you're going second, and it has the ability to self-damage when you're being damage denied and draw cards, and it can unlock your board when you're playing against Link Joker. It's a mandatory inclusion for every deck, so just pick some up. They're like $10 now. They're a lot cheaper because of the premium deck sets that just came out. You'll thank me later. So that is the main deck in G-Zone. I'll go over a couple options you have for other card choices that you could play in this deck. You could start off with the triggers. You could play an additional copy of the Regalia Crit, or this is not the right Regalia Crit. You could play an additional copy of the Regalia Crit. You could play an additional copy of the stand trigger. I wouldn't play more than 2 though. You could play the grade 3 heal as a 3 or 4 of instead of a 2 of. And then you could try another Freezing Magic Proros. You could play either one of these Ordain Owls. If you play this, the V one, I would recommend playing 4 copies of it because it's mostly usable as a ride target. What this one does, when it's rode upon, you may call it to R from Soul. And then at the end of the battle, it boosts a unit with Regalia. You put it into Soul and draw a card. So it'll just give you some additional card draws as you ride up from 0 to 3. And this one has an act skill where you choose a grade 3 Regalia from your drop zone and put it on the bottom of the deck. And then if you have a Genesis Vanguard, you choose one of your grade 3 Regalia units and you give it plus 5k. So this can help beef up an Yggdrasil rearguard column. It can help make your Vanguard really big and force your opponent to have a perfect guard or die. And it can help put back cards into the deck so you don't deck yourself out, although it'll come at the cost of reducing your trigger density. But because this puts the bottom and doesn't shuffle, you at the very least won't drive check those cards. Next we have Veratrum. This is a defensive option to play. When it's put on G, you counterblast 1 and soul blast 3. Choose an opponent's R with a standing unit and force your opponent to call a card from the top of the deck to that circle. So this is really good at punishing your opponent for putting all their triggers on one unit, because you can then force them to call over it and lose those bonuses. This can shut off your opponent's rear guards that have important effects, like restanders or cards like Honley, things like that, if they left the Honley in play. Not that you really have to worry about Honley that much in this deck. It just has a bunch of utility defensive-wise, but unfortunately it's very resource-intensive, so I don't want to play it, and it doesn't have Regalia in its name. You can play additional copies of Threat, of course. And then we get into some weird tech options. I'll lay them out here. Earth Elemental Connell is another way to solve the problem of opponents having interaction during your battle phase. This has the effect of GB1. If your units would be chosen by any fighter due to the effect of your opponent's card, they have to choose this unit as much as possible. So if they have single target interaction, Connell will absorb that and protect your board. But if their stuff only targets things in the front row or only targets attacking units, Connell can't protect because it's not a valid target for those effects. So it's a little awkward. And it's only active on GB1, so it's only good when you're striding, which is still pretty good because generally we're not going to try to develop our board until we have used stride with Minerva. But it also only has 5k shield and 5k power. It's really not holding up to the test of time. And then next we have Battle Maiden Mihikari Hime. When it's placed from hand, you can reduce the next time you Soul Blast by 3, which can make Minerva's first skill free and can cut Minerva's second skill in half. It's not a Regalia name, so it does clash, but the fact that it discounts Soul Blast so heavily means that it makes up for the fact that it's not a Regalia name, because it effectively it'll be like hitting 3 Regalia names in Soul if you can call this. It's a really strong card for discounting, but you'll find that the more you play the deck, the more you just don't need to make the combo easier to execute. You just need to play more optimally. And then last we have this card, Astrea of the Full Heavens. I think Astro Susano played this in his list for a while, which, by the way, Astro Susano is probably the foremost expert on Regalia and Keter decks and Premium in general. But this card, when it's placed, you draw a card and put a card from your hand on the bottom of the deck, and if it's on V, you Soul Charge 2. So this will help us build Soul. If we write it, it'll help us put triggers back into the deck. It can help us draw a card to dig for pieces. And at the end of the battle boosted, you can Soul Blast 2 and bounce it back to your hand. But that effect isn't super relevant in this deck. The problem, again, is that it's a 7k, which is not a good number, and it's not a Regalia name, so it clashes with the rest of the deck. But it's always worth considering this card. Because of the consistency it adds to the game plan. Currently, I'm playing Flap Angel in the spot that would be this card. But if you don't like that, and you don't like if you'd rather have hard card draw instead of grade 3 searching, this card is a strong contender to consider for the list. And I've played it at as much as 4 copies before, so it's not to be taken lightly. And that covers the deck, essentially. So let's talk about the main game plan. When you're mulliganing, you're generally trying to find a grade 3 right target and an Yggdrasil, and then the rest of your hand doesn't really matter as long as it has grade 1s and grade 2s. Ideally, it would look something like this, where you would ride this, ride the Regisa, and then check top 5 and call something good, and then ride an Angelica and call an Yggdrasil. You would also hopefully be able to stride on your turn 3 going second into Minerva, and you would use Yggdrasil to search for a Norn, put it behind the Vanguard. You would also go Force 2 on the Vanguard. In my opinion, you should go Force 2 basically every game. And then you're going to use this effect and whatever additional stuff you have to churn through your deck and build Divine Gauge under Norn. And then you're going to swing boosted. You're preferably going to want to also get a Divine Gauge under this. And also get some kind of rear guard next to it. So that you can attack and use Yggdrasil to boost it and protect it. You want to leave Yggdrasil in the back row on turn 3, because then your opponent won't be able to attack it and kill it. And if it has a Divine Gauge under it, the protection effect from your Vanguard should keep it safe from anything your opponent can conjure up. But you're going to swing like this, boost, restand, swing again, and that will get you 7 drive checks on turn 3, going second on a Force 2 with a 48k Vanguard, which is pretty threatening. And then in the late game, your ideal setup will be something like moving the Yggdrasil up to the front row, getting another Norn behind it, and then getting something like this in the other column, or preferably another Norn if you can swing the resources, and then getting a ton of Regalia names into Soul by a combination using this effect and these effects to Soul Charge a bunch of stuff. And then you'll swing boosted. You'll get your quad drive after activating this first skill. You'll restand, and then you'll swing with the other 2 columns, and then you can choose whether to restand here or not. That's going to depend on how your opponent's been doing with defenses and stuff. And then you'll swing with the Vanguard, use its Soul Blast 6 effect. You'll restand your whole board after getting your triple drive. You'll have no drive checks left, and then you just swing in order of least power to greatest, potentially getting a restand here and getting a 10k power boost, swinging again, and then finishing off here with something like a 58k Vanguard with crit. If you were able to re-ride, you're also potentially threatening Force 2 on this column that had the Norn and the Yggdrasil for a lot of extra damage pressure. This combination of stuff is going to make your opponent think really hard about no-guarding this small weak column and over-guarding the Vanguard and guarding this column every single time. So the end result will generally be that your opponent has to pray you hit no triggers or that they have multiple perfect guards to survive everything. Again, the weak spot of this combo is your opponent playing some kind of retire effect from a G-Guardian or something to kill this Yggdrasil mid-battle. If they do that, none of these Norns can boost. The whole thing kind of falls apart. So you can play around that by going for the Bracing Angel ladder or by calling the Arthen to this other column. And instead then they will have to kill this because they won't be able to choose the Yggdrasil until this is gone, as long as this is in the front row. And ladder will keep them from doing anything defensively. That is the deck in a nutshell. Again, you're primarily trying to summarize, you're building as much soul as you can with Norns and with Lurigisas and with Oblation Regalia Vars, the grade 1. You're trying to build resources of those cards. You're using this to countercharge in order to keep the soul charge flowing from Norn and to keep having counterblast available to use Yggdrasil to find Norns, especially if these get retired by the opponent. You're generally shooting for the magic number of 9 Regalia names in Soul, and you want to have at least 8 cards in deck. So an important thing to remember while doing your combo on turn 4 is that you have enough cards in deck that you can activate all the Norns you need to get all the Divine Gauge you need and still be able to do 7 drive checks without losing the game. Norns effectively take 3 cards out of the deck count because they draw a card in Soul Charge 2. So you need to count your deck, and then you need to figure out how many Norns you need to activate to get all the Divine Gauge you need for that turn, and then you need to subtract 3 cards for each of those you need to do, and see if you still have 8 cards left in deck. And if you do, then you can do everything. If not, then you need to get creative by doing things like using Yggdrasil to build Divine Gauge instead of Norns, or using Thruds to move Divine Gauge over to other units, so on and so forth. And another thing to keep in mind is that if you have the 8 cards that you need, but the overtrigger is still in the deck, you might still be screwed anyways, because if you hit the overtrigger, that takes 1 additional card out, and you'll deck out. So something to consider if you are not sure how many cards left in deck you'll have, or whether the overtrigger is still in, is to consider not activating Minerva's first skill. If you just don't do that, instead you're going triple drive into twin drive, which is not nearly as powerful as quad drive into triple drive, but it's still generally good enough that you'll close the game out, especially if your opponent's at high damage or doesn't have a lot of cards in hand. But you'll ensure that you won't deck out, because most of the time you won't deck out if you're only drive checking 5 cards. It would be pretty phenomenal to run out of cards in that scenario. And you need to figure out all of these in advance. You need to do all these calculations before you make the decision of activating Minerva's first skill, which is a main phase skill. And you also need to factor it in when you're considering how many Norns to activate. So you need to do the math up front. Otherwise, you'll find yourself losing to your own deck because you activated Minerva, and then you realize you weren't going to hit 6 Regalia names unless you activated a bunch of Norns, and then now you don't have enough cards left in deck to do everything. So you're going to either have to give up a restand from Norn here, or you're going to have to not use the Soul Blast 6 effect and miss out on a lot of attacks. So keeping track of what's left in your deck, how many cards are in the deck, whether the overtrigger is out, how many Norn activations you're going to need, those sort of things. Those are the essential skills to pick up to play Regalia. Now, the good news is that all of those skills are just deck mastery, just practicing this deck, getting the reps in, getting expertise with Regalia specifically. So while that can all be kind of complicated to juggle, at least you can do it on your own by playing practice games of this deck against an imaginary opponent, or just getting enough reps in. You don't have to factor really in the opponent's game plan that much with Regalia. Your game plan is always the same. Assemble a restanding Vanguard on turn 3, and then assemble a restanding board on turn 4. So you can kind of brute force this deck into metas that you're unfamiliar with, which is nice. And it does definitely reward someone who puts in the reps and figures out the complicated lines. There will be a lot of times where you'll see a line like, oh, I need to deal Ruing for Alluri Jisa to get 2 cards into Soul specifically, so that I can get exactly the numbers I need, or I need to Froros a Norn back into the deck and a Norn into hand so that I can activate an Yggdrasil and find a Norn to get 2 Norns to combo kill the opponent. There are multi-step lines that you'll have to gain the ability to see over time, but I think you'll find that this deck is very fun to play once you get it down, and there's very few things more satisfying than swinging with a quad drive Vanguard and hitting 4 crits. It is hilarious. So that's the deck. I strongly recommend anyone who likes complicated combo decks and aggro decks to give this a shot. And the art on the Regalia cards is also very beautiful. I mean, Yggdrasil looks phenomenal. Angelica looks phenomenal. Alluri Jisa looks phenomenal. And Oblation Regalia Var is pretty cute. So that's the deck. I think we're going to see a lot of Regalia in the foreseeable future, because it seems that every time they give Genesis support for premium, it's always this archetype that gets the support, for better or worse. And I assume you will run into this deck at some point, or you'll pick it up yourself, so I think it's still a very important deck to learn about. But that's all for now. Good luck card fighting, and have a good night.